Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. So, to this year's NNP Symposium. This is our third year doing a hybrid event with Central States. So, we have plenty of people here in the room, and then we also have viewers online watching live through Zoom. So, thank you, everyone, for attending. The symposium itself is sponsored by the Eric P. Newman Numismatic Education Society, and our physical space here at Central States is sponsored by Heritage. So, thank you to both of those organizations for making this happen. A reminder for everyone watching online, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. You'll be able to participate online just like you were in the room. At the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. You can click on that at any time, send in a question via text, and we'll read it off during the Q&A. If you're in the room, you'll raise your hand, like always. So for this presentation, we have Russ Bega. And for all of the presenters, I send them a short form for getting basic information like their background info. And typically I summarize the background information for each presenter by way of introduction. I'm going to read his verbatim in its entirety. I'm an absolute delight. Russ Bega.
What can I say? Hi, everyone. Russ Bega, absolute delight. So this is an introduction to US Exonumia. So let me tell you a little bit about myself first. So I'm the COO of Harlan J. Burke Limited here in Chicago. I specialize in early US counterfeit detection and exonumia. I'm a 13-year Army vet. I'm a writer, researcher, presenter, obviously. I have my BA from Midwestern State University, and if I can make it until December and hold together my sanity, I will have my MBA from Purdue. We shall see. So let me give you guys a little roadmap kind of what to expect in this talk. So we're going to cover a lot of information. We're going to talk about US mint metals, hard times tokens, Civil War tokens, so-called dollars, private tokens and metals, elongated and encased coins, and love tokens. This is very much a primer. This is a huge, huge topic. I'm going to go into more of how big of a topic it is, but exonumia is a truly large topic. And there's still so much that still needs to be researched in this field on many, many different things. So you are not going to get a complete education here. I am still getting an education in exonumia. So a real quick background on exonumia is a term a lot of people don't necessarily encounter. But so quite literally, exonumia is numismatic items, tokens, metals, scrip, other than coins and paper money. So what I'd say, exonumia is everything that's coin-like, but not quite a coin. And I actually was never a big guy in the exo space. I never really actually cared about tokens, metals, and all those things. I was a very specialized in US coins particularly. And then when I came to Harlan J. Burke, we had no one doing exonumia, and we had just a ton of backstock and all this stuff. So with no one else to do it, I was like, all right, I guess I'll do it. And that evolved into a real love for this stuff because it's just so interesting. And I'm a research hound. I love finding out things that nobody else has figured out yet, or things that have been forgotten for a long time. And exonumia is great for that because, like I said, it is just such an incredibly huge topic. So we're going to start with metals of the United States. So the metals of the United States, the first century, 1792 to 1892 by R.W. Julian. So this is the Julian book. It was printed in the 70s. It is very, very out of print. You're going to spend about $400 to $500 to get this book today. It's a tremendous resource. And if you actually care about any of this stuff, it's a very, very good resource to have, but they are very, very expensive. So Julian broke down his categories into the following categories, and there's a bunch of them. I'm not going to read them all off, but there's assay commission metals, Indian peace metals, presidential metals, military metals, all kinds, including things like, and this is a show and tell portion as well, so you're going to get some stuff in your hands. So I'm going to hand this to you. So what's going to come around right this second is at the top of your screen. It's a Lincoln medal that was struck in 1886 to essentially the mint at this time struck a lot of large metals and a lot of different metals for sales to collectors. And the most popular metal in this series at the time was the very first Lincoln Peace medal. That had, at some point, they decided that they needed to do something else. So in 1886, they actually cut this medal. It's actually executed by William Barber. It's in gorgeous high relief. And the US Mint still makes most of these metals. You can actually still buy modern reproductions. And so, there's, like I said, there's a huge amount of different topics and subjects they did these on. But a brief overview. So all metals authorized by, let me back up a little bit. So a brief overview in the very first part of this topic. Julian starts with all of the metals that were essentially ordered by the Continental Congress. And this is the candidate for the first true US mint medal. So it's actually for Henry Lee, and he was the only recipient of a congressional medal for actions in the American Revolution, who ranked below a general at the time. Major Lee was the leader of a small cavalry force known as Lee's Legion. And this is a really interesting medal because this medal was actually voted on by the Continental Congress, but it was never struck. It wasn't struck at the time. And so in early 1792 or 1793, the dies were cut in Philadelphia, and allegedly a gold version was struck, but that's never shown up. And so I kind of I start talking about these a little bit because, again, you're going to find that these were restruck a lot. So you're going to find a lot of different restrikes in this, and it can be very daunting sometimes to figure out what is a restrike and what is an original, which is where Julian's book comes in a lot. So now we get to talk about Indian peace medals a little bit. This is another category in Julian. So this is that medal that I was mentioning earlier, the Lincoln medal that was very, very popular, and they still you can still buy that medal from the U.S. Mint. Indian peace medals are one of those categories that people know about them, they've heard about them, but they're not entirely sure. And there's different versions essentially. So you have on the right side of the screen, you have two. They're both Lincoln medals. They're both Lincoln Indian peace medals. One is in silver and looped, which is how they would have actually been presented. And then you have the bronze versions. The bronze versions were available to collectors. They weren't generally presented to, native tribes and things. So while these were a tool for, political unity and all those things, they were also, the mint was very much cashing in on collectors buying them as well. So this one is a really interesting one. So this is actually an Andrew Jackson peace medal dated 1829. It's a restrike from probably the 1860s or 70s. I find it just terribly interesting because we all know Jackson and his history with the Trail of Tears. So it's kind of one of those weird medals, but it's really interesting. So peace medals were a common form of a gift to tribal leaders dating before the French and Indian Wars. Washington actually started the tradition of the presidents, and his weren't struck. They were actually engraved. They were engraved in Philadelphia. And no official U.S. mint medal was made prior to Thomas Jefferson ordering medals to be struck in 1801. And then these were very much kind of ad hoc how they were done. Certain presidents would have them. But at some point in the 1860s and 70s, they decided that essentially every president needed a peace medal. So you'll find a common reverse, which is like that Jackson peace medal. And you'll also see one on the bottom, the shaking hands and the calumet or a peace pipe and the tomahawk. And again, you can actually still buy these medals today from the U.S. Mint. They make them in several different versions, small ones, large ones, stuff like that. So a really, really interesting category of medal. Naval medals are another really big category, which is kind of an interesting thing. You wouldn't necessarily think that. You would think that military medals would just be in one category, but during the War of 1812, there was a tremendous amount of naval warfare happening, and especially on the Great Lakes. And if you know any little bit about naval history, you get really good imagery out of the War of 1812. So, for example, this medal is a restrike from 18. The medal was ordered in 1817, and this is John Lawrence. John Lawrence captained the ship on. He was in an engagement on the Great Lakes, and he very famously raised the "Don't give up the ship" flag. So this is one of those, and like I said, they struck about 12 or 15 different versions for different naval heroes. So it's a whole category of their own, which is really, really interesting. And again, this is actually a restrike, and we know this one is a restrike particularly because Julian actually mentions that the reverse die shattered at some point. and they had to cut brand new dies for it. And they know this for a couple reasons, but one of the really interesting reasons they know this is they compared the West Point specimen, and it turns out the West Point specimen is not an original. It's actually a restrike with those recut dies. But the obverse die is actually the original die. And these were done in about the 1860s. So they were, at that time, they were taking original dies, they were taking old dies, and if they needed to recut them or they needed to redo them, they would redo them. So that's, kind of another interesting piece. The U.S. Mint really making things for profit as well at that time. So commemorative medals are actually really neat too. And this is a particularly really interesting one. It has a really fun story. So this category in Julian ranges in size. This is actually on a $50 planchet. It's a standard 90% $50 planchet. And it's a pretty rare medal. And it's got a very interesting story. So this is the Mecklenburg Declaration. So in North Carolina, allegedly, as legend says, on the 20th of May, 1775, the citizens of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, essentially they made their own Declaration of Independence. They allegedly sent a letter to the king themselves saying that we, the people of Mecklenburg County, are separating from Britain. So allegedly they have they made the claim to it. So these were made in 1875. And what's really neat about them is, one, they were made on standard $50 planchets. The design was done by Barber, and they are just really, really neat. And there's only about 50 of them that are still known today. So they're pretty rare. But this is one of those things that if you look at it, you have no idea what it is. A lot of times it's one of those things that a dealer could just throw it to the side because they don't know what it is. But it's a US Mint product. It's not a coin, but it is a US Mint product. So I actually really like the US Mint side of it because it shows that the early U.S. Mint and even, the 19th century U.S. Mint, they weren't just necessarily worried about coinage at this point. Now they were actually able to perfect the artistic craft more. And I think that gets lost in just the coinage side of it. So that's why I really like this stuff. I really like this stuff a lot. Yes. It's actually a hornet's nest. So yes. So yeah, the Carolinas very famously during the Southern campaign of the Revolution, Lord Cornwallis is alleged to have said that the Carolinas are a hornet's nest. So it's actually a hornet's nest and a Liberty cap. So it's very, very neat. So hard times tokens are a different category. So we're out of Julian now, and now we're on to all the other stuff. So hard times tokens are a really interesting piece of U.S. history, and they kind of get overshadowed by Civil War tokens, I feel. But so essentially in 1832, President Andrew Jackson ran for re-election, and he called for the abolition of the Second Bank of the United States. He won the election, and he worked to weaken the bank before their charter expired in 1836. When without the Bank of the United States, there was some problems. And without the Bank of the United States, essentially there was a large hoarding of specie. And so there was no more coinage. And this even affected copper, not just precious metal. So hard times tokens were essentially tokens made by private individuals, the size of large cents, that would circulate as large cents, essentially. And you would get a bunch of really interesting designs on them. Some of them were pro-Jackson. A lot of them were anti-Jackson. And then you get some really interesting designs. Like on the right, you have the very famous Am I Not a Woman and a Sister, which is a take on Am I Not a Man? It's an anti-slavery token. So, even at this time, this is still before the Civil War, you're still getting a lot of that political uneasiness, and you can actually start to see it pop up in some of this stuff. So it's really interesting, and they generally don't break the bank. There are some incredibly rare ones, but you can find most types for really under $100 most of the time, especially circulated. So they're a really fun way to collect a lot of different things. I know guys that collect only pro-Jackson things. I know guys that only collect anti-Jackson things. I know guys that only collect things that have, a satirical political bent, some of it if it's related to banking. So that's kind of what's fun about this side of the numismatic field is that, especially with this, you get to collect however you want and no one can really say anything. there's no right way to collect tokens a lot of the times. So now Civil War tokens, this is very much the same idea. In 1861, the United States suspended the issue or the payment in specie. So you could all of the coinage just dried up so fast. And we all know that they had to issue fractional currency and things to keep the economy going. And this was one of the things that kind of filled that void. Again, there's no small change anymore. So before in hard times tokens, they were the size of large cents, but we're in the 1860s now. So now they're the size of regular Indian cents, essentially. And again, you get a lot of pro-union messaging on them. You get the occasional satirical political things. But what you really get a lot here is store cards. And again, this is another really neat way to collect. I know guys that only collect Wisconsin store cards. And a store card is essentially just an advertisement for whatever store that is or whatever shop, whatever purveyor. And so they would put, a lot of times, good for in trade, things like that. There's also things called sutler tokens that exist in this space, which were essentially sutlers were private individuals that sold to the army. So you'll find sutler tokens, sutler script, and all things like that. And again, this is a huge, huge topic. You find really, really rare ones. A fair amount. You find really, really common ones a fair amount. But again, this is stuff that you can get for a lot of times under $50 or $100 and nice stuff too. So it's a great way to collect on the Civil War side, especially, we all know that Civil War coin dates generally command a premium. This is a really good economical way to get some neat Civil War history without absolutely breaking the bank. And like I said, they go the width and breadth. You have political, you have pro-union, and a lot of store cards from the North on all over the place. One of my absolute favorite areas of exonumia, which is one that I've very much fallen into, are so-called dollars. So so-called dollars are, and I'm going to pass one, so-called dollars are essentially, they're a very broad category of tokens and metals, and there's a lot of loose definitions for them, but essentially they have to be about dollar sized. This can also include gold dollar size. So it's kind of funny. There are some things that don't count as a so-called dollar because they're smaller than a dollar. And then there's really, really little tiny ones that are the size of a gold dollar that count. So it's a very weird kind of category. But generally what you find so-called dollars from are actually the expos. So World Expos, the one that's going to be coming around right this second, is actually from the Chicago's World's Fair of 1893. And so that's where you generally find them, is in the expos. So one of my favorites is on the right. That's from the Trans-Mississippi Expo in Omaha in 1898. And you'll find that a good chunk of these, it's technically an official mint medal. It was struck by the U.S. Mint on the premises. That's generally what a lot of these so-called dollars are. Is they were produced on site by the U.S. Mint. The U.S. Mint would bring a press, and this was the souvenir from the U.S. Mint building. And they did these for a lot of the different expos. This is another design done by Barber, so it's very interestingly numismatically, again, because it's not just a one-off token somebody made in their basement. It's made by the U.S. Mint. It's made, it's designed by Barber. So it is a U.S. Mint product, but it's not necessarily treated like a U.S. Mint product because it comes from the expos. On the left is one of my favorite ones. I don't know why this is considered a so-called dollar, considering it's the size of a $50 gold slug. But it is essentially a $50 gold slug, gold-plated, from the 1915 Panama Pacific Expo. So so-called dollars come, like I said, just a huge, huge amount. Mostly from the expos. You'll find most of them are actually from the 1893 World's Fair because they just made so many commemorative things for it. So that's a big piece of that. Private tokens and metals. This is a whole nut roll. There is no one standard reference for any of this. You have Rualu, which does tokens and metals, and it's a book about yay big. But that's not complete, and it'll never be complete because they're private. You don't know mintages. You don't know all of these things, but you get some really, really neat pieces in it. So if you look on the right, that is a token that was done by a gentleman named John Adams Bolin out of Philadelphia. And that particular metal has a mintage of 10. It's an incredibly, incredibly rare token. And he did a lot of what we call Washingtonia, which is basically anything Washington related. So he was very well known for that. On the right is a really interesting store card. That's actually a Farron Zerbe store card. If you don't know who Farron Zerbe is, he was a 19th century numismatist and a huckster to the highest degree. I did a talk on him a couple years ago for the ANA. He was actually responsible for the peace dollar. He was responsible for a bunch of other tokens and metals and things. He was a very interesting guy, and that's actually one of his store cards, and that's a pretty rare bird. And then at the bottom, that is a Medallic Arts Company medal from the 1970s, and those can be also very rare. In silver, that particular one has a mintage of under 200. It's about 5.5 ounces of silver. It's a very large metal. And again, there's no real reference for any of this stuff. So we have 2 case studies for you to kind of break this down a little bit. So this actually appeared in the winter edition of Central States of the Centennial. So this metal actually came across the counter in the shop. It's a big 3-inch metal. And essentially it landed on my desk and I'm looking at it. And the first thing I do when I have something that I have no idea what in the world it is, just Google it. Google the legends, see if anything pops up. All right, nothing pops up. So then I have to start doing this deep dive and figuring out what in the world this daggone thing is. So the very long story short about this particular metal is it is from the 1897 Chicago Horse Show, and it was awarded to a guy named M.W. Dunham. So Mark Dunham, if any of you from around this neck of the woods are familiar with Dunham Castle, it's just 40 or so miles out west. Mark Dunham was the largest horse breeder in North America, and he entered his horse Royal Standard into this competition. This competition had like 3,000 entries. It was huge. And how I found out more about this medal is I actually had to start reading about the horse show because there's nothing about the medal that exists. So it turns out in this horse show, a different horse, Injury, from 2 Canadian brothers, won grand champion. 2 days later, it was found out that that horse was not a thoroughbred, and the award was rescinded, and it was then awarded to M.W. Dunham. My personal opinion is that this medal was a mea culpa from the State Board of Agriculture to Mark Dunham for essentially getting it wrong. This medal was done by a company called Spalding, not that Spalding. It's a different one. They were called the Tiffany of the West is how they build themselves in this time period. And they actually made a different token. They made Bryan money, which were small tokens, which essentially was for the free coining of silver, whole other topic. But in all of my research on Spalding and Company, I never found any records of them making any metal larger than 1 inch. And this is a 3-inch metal, and it is high relief, and it's gorgeous. So this is actually the only known 3-inch metal from Spalding and Company now. This was placed with a really advanced collector at last year's Central States, actually. So this is one of those ones that, again, there's no standard reference for this stuff. You got to do all the research and find out about the events, and you got to put all the pieces together and make informed decisions. This is a really fun one. This is another one by John Adams Bolin, and this one has a fun story. So if any of you guys know about Harlan J. Burke, we've been in business for over 60 years. We've been in the same location for over 40, and we have stuff everywhere. You guys know coin dealers. We're not the cleanliest of people. There's boxes of stuff everywhere. And one of the things that I've taken over is our counterfeit collection. And I started getting it together, and I'm working on getting it cross-referenced and all those things. And I come across this piece, and it's in an NGC body bag as not genuine. As they sent it in as an authentic 1780 bar cent. Well, it's not a bar cent. It's actually a facsimile. So it was made by John Adams Boland in 1862. This is the first piece that he did. He was a very, very talented die cutter. So he made this piece, he made the dies for it, and Lovett in Philadelphia, who's, if you know anything about him, he's the gentleman that commissioned the Confederate cents. He got his hands on these dies, and according to him and his advertising of these pieces, he says he bought these dies because they were too dangerous to be out there, because they were too good. But I do have 50 in copper for sale and 10 in silver for sale. So, he was really, protecting the hobby as long as he could make a little bit of money. So this piece, like I said, it has a reported mintage of about 50. There's about 30 known today in copper and about 3 in silver right now. But this was in our fake bin. And it sat there for probably 15 years in our fake bin. And now it's about a $3,000 piece just because it is what it is. So, it's one of those things that sometimes they're very unassuming, and it turns out that they're actually really, really good. So we'll talk about elongateds for just a second. I actually have one of the earliest ones to pass out. So elongateds, like many other inventions, actually made their debut at the 1893 World's Fair. And this was at a time where there was no collar, essentially. So you didn't just have to put a penny in. I have seen elongated 1893 World's Fair stuff on Canadian large cents, seated dimes, Indian head cents. This is on a shield nickel. They come on all kinds of different denominations. So we're all familiar with elongateds now, but at the time this was pretty revolutionary technology. This is pretty neat. There is a couple standard references on this. Yesterday's or yesteryear's elongated is a really good reference on them. There are some that have a pretty decent value, mostly going to be from the expos, but there is a serious collecting sphere for these. I know a lot of us look at elongateds and we're kind of like, it's a cheap souvenir, but there actually is a real collectible market for these, for the early good ones. So encased coins, so they're obviously private issue. Most of the time they're advertising pieces or good luck charms. So the general rule that exists with these is what you generally find is encased cents. And the general rule of thumb is as the denomination gets larger, the rarer and more costly the piece is, because, at this time, 50 cents is real money. And then you have something like this with a $2.50 gold coin in it. That's real money. That was a piece that actually came through the shop that was really neat. There's only a few of them known, and they were actually done in the Chicago area for a lawyer. It was essentially his Christmas bonus to his people in 1904. But they're pretty darn rare. You do not see them because who's going to give up $2.50 for a token, a thing at that time. One of the last things I'm going to talk about is going to be love tokens. So love tokens are super, super fun and super neat. So coins very often served as mediums for artists or for artisans. Again, you have to kind of think of the cost and all of these things at the time. A $50 especially is a wonderfully sized piece that you can actually get some detail on. And so with love tokens, you find them in all kinds of different qualities, all kinds of different designs. They're all one-off pieces done by different artisans. So on the left, we had probably one of the nicest period enamel pins ever that I've ever seen come in. And that's all just very, very daintily done enamel work. It has a pin back. The pin was complete. And that, it was about a $300 piece for just that. And then obviously you get very intricate designs. Sometimes you'll have, this is just the letter D, but sometimes you'll have full names, you'll have full dates, you'll have even a little story on them. They can go from just the whole range. So that, my friends, is your very, very short crash course on US Exonumia. I have given some resources here. The resources are very, very valuable, and you should absolutely use them. So TAMS, the Token and Metal Society, great group of people. They do so much, and they have a wonderful journal. The Love Token Society, again, great people. They are crazy for all things love tokens. The Metal Collectors of America, which are always wonderful. United States Tokens by Russell Ralu. That's a thick volume about yay. But you can find them. And then, of course, Metals of the First Century, this book by Julian. This is invaluable if you're looking at early U.S. mint stuff. One thing that I want to kind of talk about, though, that is actually, I think, an opportunity for anybody that's actually interested in especially like U.S. mint metals. So if you notice, this is the first 100 years. This is 1792 to 1892. There is no standard reference for U.S. mint metals after 1892. None at all. So a lot of times I get mint metals from after 1892, and it is a complete slog fest trying to find more information about them. So, you figure that book was printed in the 70s, and no one has done more of the research. No one has collated more of it. So when I tell you there's a tremendous world out there of this stuff, there truly is, and I really, really encourage anybody that's interested, has any little bit of interest, just dip your toe, because you can't get burned too much. So.
You step over here. Thank you.
This is why we can't hear.
Nice things. I
Can you
know.
imagine? Okay, come back right here. This was your destination. All right. Then we are going to open it up for Q&A. If you're online, send them in via text with that button at the bottom of your screen. Len will be reading them out from the audience as we go. So we're going to start with, I see a hand in the room.
Necessity tokens are hardship tokens. Did they have any economic value to them? Can we use them in transactions?
Yes, they were generally designed to be used in transactions. Most merchants would accept them. Because again, at this time, they were the same size as a standard US circulating coin. So they would make them to be the same size as a large cent. And at that point, there was no specie in the economy. So people just very readily accepted them. Tokens very much circulated in this country for a very, very long time, even going back to the colonial past. So tokens were always accepted.
And follow-up question. Were they authorized by any government?
No, not at all. So what you'll actually find a common theme on a lot of them is you'll see things like not 1 cent, or it'll say not 1 cent for tribute. So they're getting around giving it a denomination by putting a not 1 cent or not a cent, things like that. So they operated in a gray area at the time, but no one really cared. No one really made that much of a fuss because it was the economic reality that they just had to circulate.
Well, it's kind of strange comparing mentally to say German Nobel.
Yeah.
First World War. In order, any town can issue them, but that town has to make a deposit with Bundesbank. So it has like official.
It has official backing. Yeah, these were just private outfits, just making store cards and accepting them. So.
And again, follow-up question: why can't I start issuing necessity tokens right now? Who would believe them? Why people believe
I would send an email to Bernard von Nothaus if you want to create your own currency system. The feds don't take too kindly to it. This is true. It's interesting because you're very correct. Goldbacks are essentially just a new form of a token or something of the sort. It's the same with the Liberty Dollar. If nobody knows the story of the Liberty Dollar, Bernard von Nothaus had the Royal Hawaiian Mint in Hawaii for years and years, and he started creating a voluntary currency called the Liberty Dollar. It was in when silver was $10 an ounce, and it was denominated in $10. It said Liberty. It had a picture of Liberty. It said God. I believe it was God, not God our trust. It was very similar. And the feds did not take too kindly to this, and he vacationed for about 5 years in federal prison because they convicted him of counterfeiting of all things. So yeah.
Yeah, but
Okay.
he was, again, put in the context to it was because it was too similar to his currency.
Yes.
If it was said, just my buck, it would be no problem.
Yeah.
And this is what bothers me about the whole thing. Why can't anybody do that?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Kind of building on the hard times tokens, one thing I've always been curious, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on, you say these private companies are producing them because the government can't. What economic advantage do they have to spend the money on making these tokens that would go out in circulation?
Because they literally had nothing else. There was no other species. There was no other change. And you have to remember, this is the 1830s and 40s. So banknotes are super not accepted yet. It takes the Civil War and the complete lack of specie and the federal government to issue greenbacks for people to even really start considering using paper money. So with the hard times tokens, these merchants would make them because they needed them for the commerce. And that was really it. It was kind of a self-sustaining ecosystem, honestly, in some of it.
Immense cost. Too.
Yeah, absolutely. There would be a cost, but it's either that or you don't do business.
Right.
So
okay, I know we have quite a few online, so let's go ahead and hit one of those and then we'll come back to the room.
All right, a well-known numismatist from Atlanta asks, do you see many of the 1980 to 1984 American Arts gold medallions over the counter? And if so, what's the market like for them?
yes. So prior to the issuing of silver eagles, gold eagles, the U.S. Mint struck arts medallions, and you'll find them in basically different artists. So my personal favorite is Robert Frost, but you find them in different people, and essentially they are not treated like good gold, really. I generally buy them at like 98% of melt and I sell them for like 1% over. So they're out there, but no one really likes them all that much.
Okay, the one in the room.
Do you have any tips on storage of metals?
Yes, storing metals is tough. So to be really honest, I generally just have a very large box. And I have, obviously you guys have seen the metals that come on there in big flips. I generally just put a piece of styrofoam, and then I just essentially either stack them or, kind of get them into some semblance of order. But yes, storing metals is difficult. That is actually another interesting thing that you'll find on some metals. Again, the metal collecting community and the coin collecting community, while they do overlap, there are some pretty significant differences. I had a large metal collection. This guy had collected metals for 60 years or so, and he generally would wax his metals. So he would actually apply, and this is an old hobby thing. You would apply a layer of wax to your metals to protect them. So you'll find stuff like that as well. So
Does desiccant help?
It can, yeah. It's not going to hurt anything. Depending on where you're at, it might be a good idea, especially for some of the bronze and things, because, it does react.
Okay, I know we have quite a few more online.
Yeah. Said you didn't talk about merchant counterstamps on U.S. and foreign coins. Would you consider them as store cards or their own category?
I would definitely consider them as store cards. The problem with the counterstamps, one of the authoritative reference on it is Brunk. And Brunk, when you actually go through Brunk, it essentially just has a picture and it's like, this thing exists. And then that's kind of it. And so you'll spend a couple hours going through and then you find it and there's the picture and there's no other information. And you're like, well then. So it definitely is a category, but it can be a very daunting category because there are some counterstamps that are rarer than crap that people pay up money for. And then you have all the other ones, sometimes I have random ones with like Ford or, all the other different ones. So they're definitely their own category to an extent, but I mean, most of the time they were store cards. So you could make the argument that they do belong there.
Okay, do we have any others in the room? We'll go back online.
It said, I'm really interested in collecting the 1876 Centennial Expo medals. Is Julian the best book or is there something else?
So yeah, Julian is generally going to be your best book for all of that stuff. The 1876 award or the 1876 Expo medals, they're fairly readily available. They're very large 3-inch medals, very thick. And they generally retail for, maybe $100 to $200 per. So they're out there. They did an amazing amount of them because they had so many categories for awards at that time for that expo.
All right.
All right, we have a question from a well-known publisher in the numismatic industry. He asks, are you familiar with Guidebook of U.S. Coins or U.S. Tokens and Metals by Dave Bowers and Catherine Yeager? High-level overview of a lot of.
Yes, that is another very good high level, and that's kind of the thing with this stuff is that there has been a lot written about it, but so much of it is almost a survey or a very shallow dive because, like I said, with just Civil War tokens alone, there are so many different varieties of, this guy did one like this, but then he had another one done that was just a little, there's so many of those varieties and things that it's very hard to get them all in one volume. But yeah, for the generalist, another really good resource.
All right. Anything new in the room? Nope. We'll stick with online. What's next?
Can you talk about clubs and societies in this space, such as TAMS?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, so TAMS is a tremendous organization. So you have TAMS, the Love Token Society, and the Metal Collectors of America are the ones that I really kind of just called out. TAMS have been tremendous. They've helped. I've had more than a few members help me when I have some questions about things. Because again, I'm still learning EXO. I will never not be learning Exonumia. So they're a tremendous resource. What I really like about the collector space for the metals and tokens is it's very welcoming. And it's, like I said, it's very large. And you get, you will find guys that specialize in the most niche thing ever, and it's like you have a question about that one thing, they have somebody for it.
All right. Let's do one more online and then we'll come back to the room.
Question on the love tokens. Most of these are 19th century, but have you seen love tokens created by U.S. troops overseas in World War I and II? I
have seen a little bit of that stuff. I would generally consider that trench art. And trench art is a thing. So as soldiers, we love souvenirs. We love souvenirs. We bring back the dumbest things, and we mark on the dumbest things. Another category that I could have put in here on Exonumia would be something like short snorters. Short snorters are bills that were generally signed. The tradition started with air crews in World War II, but you generally find, even just guys that were shipping out together would write, November 20th, 1942, shipped to North Africa, and then they all sign it. That's another interesting piece of Exonumia. Mm-hmm. So. Okay, then I think we had another one in the room. Yes.
I was just going to make a comment. You don't have Civil War Token Society out there.
I do not. No, I did. I should have it there. Yes, like I said, one of the best things about shows like this as well is all of the collectors clubs are set up downstairs. And that's where you want to go. You want to go talk to those people because, like I said, there's so many of these organizations that specialize in one very particular thing, and they're just great resources.
That was the Civil War Token Society. In case the audio didn't come through online.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Just to build on what she said and what you said, there are state organizations which might be more accessible. So
absolutely.
I know TAMS and Mitch TAMS, which work with the national, but you might find it local.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, there's one more in there.
Just to point out also that, for instance, one of my interests is colonial and pre-federal. So a lot of what's circulated in what became the United States or before the mint was established would be technically the same kind of thing, privately issued tokens that were used as money because there wasn't anything else available, or back in England, what Americans call Condor token, but Brits just call British tokens from the late 18th century. Similarly, some of them advertising, some of them political, but circulated because George III wasn't putting copper out into circulation.
And that's actually, that's actually a really interesting point too, because occasionally I had a really interesting piece that illustrated this really well. A lot of the times those tokens would actually be purchased by the mint, and then they would actually either be cut down to make half cents, or they would just be struck over to make large cents. So I had a really neat 1795 half cent that was struck on a Talbot, Allen, and Lee token.
Right.
And if you know anything about that token, it has a gorgeous full rigged ship on the obverse. And so in Liberty's hair, you could still see the rigging of the ship. So those tokens were important for a couple of reasons. One, because they filled that void of small change. And two, the US Mint a lot of times would either buy them by the keg from England, or they would buy them from whoever imported them, and then they would end up turning them into large cents. So they were important for a couple of reasons.
Okay, I think we have another one or two online.
All right, a well-known book person also notes the guidebook of Civil War tokens and a guidebook of hard times tokens.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Any others online?
Yeah, question. Do you see much US Philippine material over the counter? He recommends the book Philippine Metals and Tokens.
Yes, the occasional US Philippine piece comes over the counter. It's one of those things that a lot of people don't necessarily know about. So it's kind of one of those oddball things. I actually really, really, really like US Philippine stuff. It's an area that I get into a fair amount because there's a tremendous amount of interesting history in it. So yeah, they come across every so often. Actually, that there's a whole other piece of exonumia you could talk about even there, which is the leper colony that was on one of the Philippine islands, and they issued their own currency, their own script. And so there's another piece of exonumia. Like I said, it never ends. You can always find another category somewhere.
Okay. Have another one online?
One other question on that horsemanship medal.
Yes.
How do you price something like that?
Yeah. So that is a really interesting nut roll. With that one, it was... I had that dilemma. I had no idea what in the world I was going to price it at. And that one actually resolved itself very quickly, because I had a gentleman come over and he says, hey, I hear you have this thing. I'm writing a book on awards medal and I'd like to put it in there. And I was like, absolutely. He's like, and I'm going to send a well-known person over that may be interested in purchasing it. And so he came over, we talked for about an hour, and we came to some semblance of a price. And that was kind of it. I was thinking that, it might be an auction piece, but I had the opportunity to place it with a really advanced collector, and so I took that route instead. But yeah, with some of it, it's anybody's guess, because how do you price a previously unknown, unique piece of equestrian thing? I don't know, but take educated guesses. That's about all you can do.
Okay. Do we have anyone else in the room? No? Okay. Any others online?
Yeah, one more online. Can you talk a little bit about orders and military decorations?
Sure. Yeah. So orders and military decorations are... I don't know that I necessarily consider them part of exonumia. I know some people do, and there is a case to be made for it, because especially a lot of the World War I, World War II medals, they were executed by the US Mint, all those things. But they're a whole separate category. You'll find that most people in the coin space don't deal with them as much unless they have a background in the military or they like militaria. And awards and decorations can be very odd, especially some of the foreign ones. There's different laws on some of them. Here in the States, it's not that big of a deal, but it's a whole interesting subject, and it's really one that only starts. You can make the argument that starts in 1860 with, the 1860s with the Medal of Honor, but we didn't issue order and decorations to troops really until the start of World War I with the Purple Heart. And then now we give them away like candy and we all look like Mexican generals, but I digress. Yes, sir.
A word of the day, it's called phaleristics.
There we go.
It's a discipline about orders and phaleristics.
Phaleristics. Oh, interesting. See, I learned something new.
There's a Wikipedia article about it. I mean, people do this.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. More online?
Yeah, is exonumia collecting, gaining, or losing popularity?
I would like to say that it's gaining popularity. What I've noticed over the last few years is that the coins that people are buying, or the objects people are buying, are ones that have good stories behind them. And that's what I've said for a really long time, is numismatics is a storytelling business. And so much of this stuff is never been seen by the general public, or it's very esoteric and different, that I end up selling more tokens and metals on the story than anything else. So I think that I would like to think that it's getting a little bit stronger because more people are getting interested in the story than anything else.
All right. Anything else? Either location?
One more online.
Okay.
What's your opinion of the modern silver medals coming out of the US Mint, silver presidential medals, American Liberty silver medals?
I like a lot of what the US Mint is doing. I think the flowing hair medals were one of the smartest things they've done in a really long time. I wonder how many of the other medals are selling. So right now the US Mint is redoing, they're reissuing all the presidential medals in silver again. And I think they're at like James K. Polk right now. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm not exactly banging down the door to spend $300 on a James K. Polk medal. So I find it interesting that they're reaching back into their back catalog with some of this stuff and doing it. But I love the military series that they recently did. It's very well done. I think the US Mint is starting to move with the medals onto the more artistic side, and they're getting really, really good at it. And they're really fleshing that out more. So I like what they do. I don't buy everything, but they've done some really good issues lately, I think.
All right. Anyone else in the room? Anyone else online? All right, then I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, everybody.
We will be back at noon with Jesse Kraft speaking on mining for sovereignty, coinage of the Mexican War of Independence from 1810 to 1821. So hope you all can join us back for that one. Otherwise, thank you for watching.
There you go. Okay, good to know.